So hey there, Bob-a-nites, your friend in the neighborhood, Tech Penguin Bob here. And before I start on today's topic, just want to give you a heads up that some of the things mentioned in this podcast can be rather technical and complicated, and it's perfectly okay if anyone has trouble understanding what I'm talking about. And if anyone who listens to this podcast and the Tech Talk today and you have questions, please feel free to contact me and ask. And I'll do my best to try to clarify my podcast and put the cookies on the lower shelf, so to speak, for anyone to be able to get them. So anyway, today's topic is one that has gripped me with rather emotionally. As some of you know, I'm a rather techie penguin and have been supporting technology, computers, and networks for a very long time. It has been my main career over the years working in IT. I have seen the advancement of technology and operating systems like Unix, DOS, and Apple's OSs all the way up to the current versions of Linux, Windows, and Mac OS. So, at one point, with what I call the operating system wars, I've seen the actual downright extreme dislike of Linux by everything Microsoft and thought things would never change for my favorite OS, Linux. However, here today, to my delight, I am here to tell you that over the years I have seen a fundamental shift in the way Microsoft views Linux and open source. They have really started to embrace it, which couldn't make me happier. However, there are a few articles I have found recently online that have given me a momentary pause, and I am feeling kind of conflicted on the topic. The articles talk about the possibility of Windows 11 running a Linux kernel under the hood instead of the normal Windows NT kernel. So let's talk about it. So stay tuned, Bob-a-nites. Let's discuss together just what it could mean if Microsoft did switch to a Linux kernel in Windows 11.
You're listening to Penguin Thoughts. These are the thoughts that penguins are thinking when they were thinking that they were thinking about the thoughts they were thinking when they were thinking them. That is, we think.
So, like I said, I read these articles online about the next Windows maybe being Linux under the hood, and I'm feeling kind of mixed feelings about that. I will also put the links to the articles in the description of this podcast, so you can read them for yourself. These articles speculate that it is possible the next version of Windows, aka maybe Windows 11, that Microsoft may actually decide to no longer use their own Windows NT kernel that they've been using since the first inception of Windows NT back in the day. Instead, these articles go further to indicate that the NT kernel could be replaced with a Linux kernel. Now, to most Windows users, this would not really be all that noticeable, and the look and feel of Windows would still be the same for them. What would change here is what is running under the hood and behind the scenes of the GUI of Windows, the kernel, the engine of the OS, so to speak. So I'm going to talk about the meaning of a Linux kernel in the next version of Windows and what all that entails and what it implies. And I'm also going to then talk about what that means to me personally, coming from a person who has been supporting technology for most of his life and also a lover of Linux and all things Penguin-related OS and open source. So, first, what does it mean and what are the implications of the next version of Windows having a Linux kernel instead of its normal NT kernel? Well, for starters, this is a game changer and may be a way for Microsoft to better keep their OS more stable, more secure, and more reliable. Lately, every time Windows has been doing an update to patch yet another issue in the operating system or to help it to make it more stable or more secure, it seems to just compound the issue. To quote Stephen J. Vaughan Nichols in his article, updates have grown so sloppy you have to seriously wonder whether it's safer to stay open to attacks or just upgrade your system with a dodgy patch. This is where maybe switching to a more kept, up-to-date kernel might be a good choice for Microsoft. For example, like switching to the Linux kernel, which is kept up to date by a worldwide group of open source Linux lovers like myself. The Linux community is always patching and fixing and maintaining the current Linux kernel as secure and stable as it can, with a very vast, passionate community driving that whole process. Another implication that could see a reason for the kernel switch by Microsoft is the recent shift in their IP offerings model. I'm referring to their move to a SaaS, or software as a service model, like Office 365, where you lease the use of the software instead of owning it. So maybe it is possible that Microsoft is wanting to do the same with the next release of Windows, where it'll be a SaaS model instead of an owning and having a full version of Windows installed on your PC. You'll have to lease, and the bulk of the OS is run off of Microsoft servers as a service, aka the SaaS model. This is where in the server world and provided network services, the Linux kernel really shines. If you are unaware or living in a non-tech bubble for the past 20 years, most of the internet that the average person accesses is actually running in some form or another a Linux server or service. Be it an Apache HTTP web server providing you the web page you want to look at given on a certain website you're going to, or to streaming in a real time some media or video or audio that you're using on a TCP protocol that is being served up by a Linux server. So it makes perfect sense. The infrastructure and the backbone on the internet is already in place and been proven and tested over the years with a Linux kernel-based service model that it isn't a too far of a stretch that Microsoft might decide to go that route to be able to switch to the SaaS type service model that they want to for their next version of Windows and use a Linux-based kernel server model to do it. Even Microsoft's own virtualization enterprise service, Microsoft Azure, which originally was intended to be a way to easily virtualize and to deploy Windows servers, virtual Windows servers, today has more virtual Linux servers running on it than Microsoft's Azure platform than Windows servers, as stated by Stephen J. Von Nichols in his article. This matters because most of the money Microsoft gets as a business comes from the Azure, according to Eric S. Raymond in his Slashdot article that I also included. So like I said, moving to a Linux kernel in the next version of Windows could definitely be a game changer for Microsoft and could be also the next leap forward for them as a business. So let me talk about the second part now and discuss what this possible kernel change means to me, actually, coming from an IT background. First, I'm a little bit conflicted. Part of me loves the idea that finally, after all this time, Linux is starting to get the recognition and integration into the desktop computer world that I've been longing to see, especially as a Linux gamer and trying to play any type of Windows-only game on Linux over the years in itself has been a challenge. Oh sure, there's been Wine, Crossover, and most recently Proton Steam Play by Valve that has made great strides in bringing those Windows-only game titles over to be allowed to be played through emulation in Linux, but still there's just issues with it. So Windows switching their kernel from NT kernel based to a Linux kernel based would mean, for me, no more emulation layer needed. Also, all software applications, games, etc. that would work on Windows would now work on Linux. That's a win-win in my book. That would be awesome for me as a Linux power user who uses Linux as his main operating system. However, this is also where I'm feeling a bit conflicted. From a technical support standpoint, this could very easily and quickly become a nightmare overnight. that would mean that older versions of software and older versions of Windows would have to run on some sort of emulation layer on the new version of Windows. I have no doubt that Microsoft might do something that would allow a user to run some of their older software and older games on the new Linux kernel-based version of Windows. However, it could very easily turn out to be the same experience I've been going through over the years with Wine and getting Windows games and apps to run on Linux. Except for this would be the other way around. For the most part, Linux users just understand the woes with Wine and emulation and can handle the issues that arise from it. However, flipping it where the emulation issues are now with a Windows emulator for a non-technical person, that makes my liver quiver just a tad, the thought of supporting that situation. This is not that much different from some of the issues that will and may have already arisen with the new Apple Silicon-based computers that are out. They're RISC-based. Apple used to be RISC-based computers, and they a while back switched to their PowerPC model and went to Intel-based so they could be compatible and run Windows in dual boot on Macs. Well, now they have gone back to now making their own processors in-house, hence the new Apple Silicon, and they have gone to RISC-based again, which means they are no longer Intel-based. So that means any of the Mac OS software from the previous Intel-based Macs has to be run through some type of emulator that Apple obviously is including in the new Apple Silicon-based computers, but there's still bound to be issues that need to be resolved there. And I'm sure Apple's doing a good job of resolving that. However, there's still going to be that dealing with emulation and having to deal with that layer. There's always issues when dealing with trying to get one operating system written in one programming language to accept commands and syntax from another completely different operating system code written in a completely different programming language. Can anyone say Tower of Babel? If you don't get that reference, just think Universal Translator on Star Trek, but back when it first was created, like it was on the show Enterprise, when it didn't work so well and trying to get one language to be able to talk to another, and you didn't have any real basis to be able to work well, that's what you're trying to do here. You're trying to get an apple to talk to an orange, or an orange to talk to a rock. So anytime there's emulation involved, there's going to be issues. So it kind of concerns me about that. The second area here that I'm kind of conflicted about this, I mean, don't get me wrong, I love the idea of Linux-based Windows, but from a support standpoint, it kind of still scares me a little bit, and this is where I'm conflicted. Because Microsoft switching to a Linux kernel due to my own personal security concerns, as well as supporting other people with security concerns. For years, the vast majority of all viruses and spyware and any type of hostile attacks or exploits were always aimed and geared toward Windows, primarily an NT kernel based operating system, because that's the average operating system that an average desktop user normally uses. Now, obviously, then also there was Mac users after that, and then normally Linux users. So Linux users were kind of relegated to really not having to deal with that kind of stuff because they weren't as mainstream. So for the most part, as a Linux user, I've not had as many issues with viruses and spyware as a Windows user may have, because the code the viruses are written for, or the exploits are written for, are written to attack the NT kernel and not a Linux kernel, which is written in a completely different programming language called C. Let alone the level of security involved in just the Linux OS itself is very restrictive if you are not sudo or root access. Unlike an administrator access in Windows, there are not as many safeguards in place to prevent a security breach to the kernel level, thereby compromising the OS. So my concern here is that if Microsoft does switch over to a Linux kernel, which I would love to see, it would still also then shift the focus to all those viruses and spyware and security exploits and vulnerabilities and attacks from attacking an NT kernel based operating system to a Linux kernel based operating system, which for me hits me right where I live, because I use Linux as my main operating system. So, anyway, enough of me rambling on about my concerns and a conflicted excitement about this possibility of a Linux kernel-based version of Windows, which I would love to see. I would also love to hear from you, as my faithful Bob-a-nites followers. I would love for you to read those 2 articles that I've posted there in the description and decide for yourself. I would love to hear any of your thoughts on this possible direction that Microsoft could be taking Linux in the future. And if you have any questions about the articles or anything I have said in this podcast, I would also welcome those questions as well. Anywho, I hope you decide to come back and listen to more podcasts from yours truly if you're so inclined. I also have a YouTube channel where I make rather silly videos, as well as other social media sites, which are all linked on my Anchor podcast page, and I would be greatly honored if you come and visit and even subscribe. And as always, I'm the crazy and silly penguin named WhataboutBob, and I'm out the window because the door is shut. Later, peeps, and keep Linuxing on.